What follows is not just a story about Iran. It is a story about what war reveals when diplomacy stops hiding the truth. For years, Iran was widely seen as part of something larger than itself, a rising alignment of powers dissatisfied with American dominance, increasingly coordinated against Western pressure, and increasingly willing to test the edges of the existing international order. Russia was fighting in Ukraine. China was pressing harder across Asia and building political reach across the Middle East. Iran was expanding leverage through missiles, proxies, and choke points, and all three had reasons to cooperate: energy, sanctions resistance, diplomatic cover, military signaling, and a shared interest in weakening the coercive reach of the United States and its allies. Their January 2026 BRICS Plus naval exercise off South Africa added to that image, sending a message of strategic coordination, even if not formal alliance. Then the war came, and that image was tested. When U.S. and Israeli strikes escalated and Iran threatened the Strait of Hormuz, the conflict stopped being a regional military event and became a global systems event. Oil rose above $100 a barrel. The UN warned that the confrontation could trigger a wider regional conflict with grave consequences. Shipping routes near Hormuz became dangerous enough that some vessels began broadcasting "China owner" or "China owner and crew" in hopes of lowering the risk of attack. In a matter of days, the crisis spread from military infrastructure to global energy pricing, maritime insurance, freight routes, inflation expectations, and financial risk appetite. And in that moment, the central question became impossible to avoid. If Iran was really part of a powerful anti-Western axis, why did Russia and China not come to its aid in any meaningful military sense? That question matters because it tells us not only what this relationship is, but what it is not. It tells us what kind of world we are actually entering. And it tells us something even larger about the future of oil, inflation, shipping, financial markets, and the political architecture of the next decade. The first answer is conceptual. Iran, Russia, and China are strategically close, but they are not a mutual defense alliance. That is the single most important fact in the entire story. The strongest formal link in this triangle is the 20-year Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty signed by Putin and Pezeshkian in January 2025. The published text and contemporary analysis make clear that the agreement covers broad cooperation in security, defense, trade, energy, transport, information sharing, sanctions coordination, and regional diplomacy. But it does not create a collective defense obligation. It is a serious strategic partnership, not a treaty that compels Russia to fight for Iran if Iran comes under attack. That distinction sounds technical until war begins. In peacetime, summit photos, military drills, and strong rhetoric can make partnerships look like alliances. In wartime, the difference becomes brutal. A partner is a state that works with you where interests overlap. An ally is a state that has accepted costs and risks on your behalf. A partner may share intelligence, buy your oil, sell you technology, vote with you at the UN, or help you evade sanctions. An ally is a country that has tied part of its own security to yours. What Iran appears to have discovered in this war is that Moscow and Beijing were always closer to the first category than the second. That conclusion is not just rhetorical. It is supported by how both capitals have behaved under live combat conditions. Reuters described Iran as standing largely alone, while AP reported that Russia has remained passive militarily despite sharp condemnation of the attacks. That is the structural reason. But there is a second, deeper reason. Russia and China each have their own logic for staying out, and each logic reveals something important about the current world order. Start with Russia. On the surface, Moscow looked like the most likely candidate to help Iran. Their relationship deepened significantly after 2022, especially through the use of Iranian-designed Shahed drones in Ukraine. Their 2025 treaty formalized that closeness. If any major power was supposed to feel indebted to Tehran, it was Russia. But when the crisis escalated, Moscow's support stopped at rhetoric, diplomacy, and at most limited indirect assistance. AP reported that the Kremlin condemned the attacks strongly, yet took no visible military action on Iran's behalf, even as analysts suggested Russia may be sharing some information helpful to Iran's military effort. That is not rescue. It is careful, deniable, low-risk support.
Why stop there?
The obvious answer is Ukraine. Russia is already consumed by a long and costly war that continues to drain manpower, equipment, industrial capacity, and strategic attention. However loudly Moscow speaks about a new multipolar order, it is not strategically free. Opening a direct confrontation connected to the United States and Israel would be a second major gamble at the very moment Russia is still fighting the first. This is not simply about willingness, it is about capacity, logistics, escalation control, and the reality that great powers do not casually add wars when they are already struggling to close out one they have. But that is only half the story. The more revealing answer is that Russia may benefit from the crisis without fighting in it. Financial Times reported that the jump in oil prices could be bringing Russia roughly $150 million a day in additional revenue. AP separately noted that higher energy prices and the diversion of Western attention away from Ukraine may create strategic upside for Moscow. That makes this war unusual from the Kremlin's perspective. It is a conflict in which a partner suffers, yet Russia may gain economically and geopolitically by staying one step removed. If that is true, then the cost-benefit calculation tilts even further against intervention. Why should Russia risk a direct clash with Washington to save Tehran, if Tehran's pain is already improving Moscow's fiscal position and possibly weakening Western focus elsewhere? This is where the financial dimension becomes inseparable from the geopolitical one. If oil prices remain elevated for weeks or months, Russia is not just getting a temporary windfall, it is getting breathing room. That matters because one of the key Western strategic assumptions since 2022 has been that pressure on Russian energy income would eventually narrow the Kremlin's room for maneuver. A prolonged Middle East energy shock complicates that strategy. It can stabilize Russian revenues, soften some sanctions pressure, and force countries in Europe and Asia to think more pragmatically about available supply. In other words, a war centered on Iran may be indirectly loosening the economic vice around Russia. That is not a certainty. It depends on how long disruption lasts and how sanctions enforcement evolves. But the mechanism is already visible. There is another layer to Moscow's restraint: regional balancing. Russia does not operate only through Iran and the Middle East. It has reasons to preserve relationships with Gulf producers and to maintain diplomatic flexibility across rival camps. A military move to defend Iran would not only risk confrontation with the United States and Israel, it could also complicate Moscow's ties with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others whose cooperation matters for energy diplomacy and regional positioning. So from the Kremlin's perspective, the rational choice is to preserve Iran as a useful partner, if possible. Condemn attacks loudly, exploit the energy upside, and avoid crossing the threshold where Russia inherits Iran's war. That is not betrayal in the emotional sense. It is classic great power compartmentalization. Now look at China. Beijing's behavior is more restrained in language, but perhaps even more revealing in strategic meaning. China has not been passive. On March 5th, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said Beijing had been in contact with Russia, Iran, Oman, France, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and that China would send its Middle East envoy to the region. On March 8th, Wang Yi called for an immediate ceasefire, respect for Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity, opposition to the abuse of force, and rejection of imposed regime change. Those are serious diplomatic interventions, but they are interventions of a very specific kind. Brokers' interventions, not allies' interventions. That distinction matters because it speaks to China's model of power. Beijing seeks leverage without entrapment. It expands influence through trade, infrastructure, energy ties, supply chains, finance, and political mediation. It prefers to be indispensable without becoming automatically liable. That model has been highly effective across the Middle East because it allows China to maintain relations simultaneously with Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others. But the price of that flexibility is that China's partners often discover a ceiling. Beijing wants influence over your crisis, not ownership of your battlefield. The current war is exposing that ceiling in real time. Iran matters to China, yes, but the broader Gulf matters more. That is the core of the Chinese calculation. Once the Strait of Hormuz became a live risk to shipping and energy flows, Beijing's first priority was not how to save Iran militarily. It was how to contain disruption to the wider commercial system on which China depends. The AP reporting on vessels signaling China owner is telling here. It suggests that association with China is perceived as commercially protective, useful in reducing targeting risk because Beijing is seen as relatively neutral and economically important to Tehran. But that is exactly the point. China's real value in this crisis lies in dampening risk to trade, not in offering military guarantees to Iran. And this is where the story becomes global. A prolonged Hormuz crisis is not just an Iran problem or even a Middle East problem. It is a global energy and shipping problem with immediate macro-financial implications. AP reported oil above $100 a barrel. Financial Times and other analyses have described tightening supply, pressure on LNG flows, and growing concern that an energy shock could reignite inflation, just as many economies were hoping price pressures were cooling. Once shipping insurance jumps, detours expand. Tanker traffic becomes erratic, and commodity markets start repricing the probability of sustained disruption. Central banks are dragged back into a world they thought they were leaving behind. Weaker growth, higher input costs, and renewed inflation pressure at the same time. That combination is dangerous because it points toward a familiar but politically toxic outcome: stagflationary pressure. Not full 1970s-style stagflation necessarily, but enough of the ingredients to create policy paralysis. If energy prices remain high, countries that import fuel heavily will face rising bills, worse trade balances, and potentially weaker currencies. Firms will see transport and input costs rise. Consumers will feel it through fuel, food, and utilities. And central banks may discover that rate cuts become harder to justify even as growth softens. The Financial Times has already framed the present moment in those terms, warning that stagflationary forces are building as the Iran war and surging oil prices collide with existing economic fragilities. That does not prove a global downturn is inevitable. It does mean the balance of risks has shifted in that direction. This is where the war starts to reshape political outcomes, not just prices. High energy prices do not hit all states equally. Exporters gain, importers absorb pain. Russia, as we have seen, is an early beneficiary if the shock persists. China is vulnerable to shipping disruption, but also positioned diplomatically to play mediator. Europe faces renewed exposure to energy volatility, especially if LNG flows tighten further. Emerging markets that depend heavily on imported energy and already run thin fiscal margins are especially vulnerable. For them, a sustained Hormuz crisis can mean pressure on currencies, higher subsidy costs, more inflation, and rising domestic political strain. That is the kind of external shock that can turn economic discomfort into political instability surprisingly fast. This is an inference from the energy price shock, shipping disruptions, and known macro channels, rather than a claim that every vulnerable state will face crisis. But the transmission mechanism is clear. There is also a quiet but important lesson for military and diplomatic alignment in the 2020s. This war suggests the world is increasingly organized not into rigid blocks, but into layered networks of interest. States can be strategically close, conduct exercises together, sign sweeping partnership treaties, and still stop short of war when the costs become unacceptable. That may be the defining pattern of this decade. Not classic alliance structures everywhere, but dense webs of selective cooperation. These webs are strong enough to frustrate sanctions, move energy, share technology, and complicate Western policy. But they are often too thin to guarantee rescue under fire. If that is right, then many countries may come away from this crisis with a more hard-edged lesson about self-reliance. Strategic partnerships are useful, but when survival is on the line, vague alignment is not a substitute for actual defense commitments. That lesson will matter far beyond Iran. Countries in Asia, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe will be watching closely. They will ask whether China is emerging as a guarantor or primarily as a broker. They will ask whether Russia's partnerships are instruments of leverage rather than commitments of sacrifice. And they will ask a harder question about the future of world order. Are we moving into a system where most powers want the benefits of alignment without the liabilities of alliance? This war points toward yes. Consider the United Nations track. Russia and China have supported Iran in some diplomatic contexts, including their September 2025 effort at the Security Council to delay the reimposition of sanctions under the snapback mechanism. But when Resolution 2817 was adopted on March 11, 2026, condemning Iran's egregious attacks against neighboring states, Russia and China did not veto it. They abstained. That is a revealing posture. It says that both countries still want to preserve ties with Tehran, but neither is prepared to pay every diplomatic cost, much less military cost, to protect it unconditionally. They support Iran as long as support does not override larger priorities. That abstention matters because it mirrors the broader pattern of the war. Stay close enough to signal value, stay far enough to preserve freedom of action. And that is likely to shape the next phase of the crisis as well. If we look ahead 3 to 6 months, the most plausible base case is not full de-escalation and not total regional collapse, but something in between. A stop-start conflict in which escalation and restraint alternate, shipping remains partially disrupted, insurance costs stay elevated, energy markets retain a war premium, and Russia and China continue exactly the posture they have now: diplomatically active, militarily distant, strategically opportunistic. That scenario fits the current incentives of all three capitals. Iran wants survival and leverage. Russia wants upside without entanglement. China wants stability without military liability. The next worst scenario is also easy to imagine: sustained or repeated disruption through Hormuz, broader attacks on regional energy infrastructure, LNG dislocation, and a sharper global inflation shock. In that world, the consequences become much larger than this war alone. Central banks would face renewed pressure. Rate cut expectations could be pushed back. Equity markets would likely price slower growth and higher input costs. Governments might resort to strategic reserves, subsidies, emergency shipping measures, and political pressure on producers. Russia would probably gain more from price strength, while importers would absorb even more pain. The farther that scenario advances, the more likely it becomes that the war reshapes domestic politics in countries far from the battlefield. This is a scenario analysis, not a prediction, but it follows directly from the market behavior already visible. There is also a more optimistic scenario, though it depends heavily on diplomacy. If China, Oman, and other intermediaries can help engineer a limited de-escalation, not peace, but enough restraint to restore more normal shipping through Hormuz, then prices could retreat, some of the inflation risk could fade, and the world might treat this as a severe but temporary energy shock, rather than the beginning of a new era of chronic disruption. In that scenario, China's role would become more important, not less. But note the paradox. China's influence would rise precisely because it helped stabilize flows, not because it fought on Iran's behalf. That would reinforce the broader conclusion of this entire crisis. Beijing's power in the region is increasingly real, but it is the power of brokerage, trade, and systemic relevance, not the power of an alliance guarantor. And that brings us back to the title question. Why didn't Russia and China help Iran? Because neither relationship was designed for that kind of help. Russia's treaty with Iran was broad, but not binding in the military sense. China's partnership with Iran is valuable, but subordinate to wider commercial and energy priorities. Both powers see advantage in supporting Iran at the level of diplomacy, rhetoric, and selective coordination. Neither sees sufficient advantage in risking direct war with the United States and its allies for Iran's sake. Once the bombs began to fall, the underlying architecture of the relationship became visible. It was a network of converging interests, not a pact of shared sacrifice. That is the geopolitical answer. The financial answer is equally stark. This war is already redistributing pain and leverage across the world economy. It is raising revenues for exporters like Russia. It is pressuring importers through oil, shipping, and insurance. It is increasing the value of diplomatic access for a country like China. And it is reminding markets that the energy system remains one of the fastest ways regional wars become global economic problems. If the shock persists, the consequences will extend far beyond Iran, far beyond the Gulf, and far beyond this moment's headlines. They will show up in inflation prints, central bank decisions, budget deficits, subsidy bills, freight rates, election messaging, and the pricing of geopolitical risk across asset classes. So the deepest lesson here may be the simplest one. Iran did not learn that powerful friends are useless. They are not. It learned something more unsettling. Powerful friends are often useful precisely because they keep their distance. Russia can profit from the war without owning it. China can shape the diplomacy without inheriting the battlefield. Both can remain close to Iran while preserving room to maneuver around Iran. And that, in the end, may be the defining feature of this era of geopolitics. Proximity without obligation, coordination without sacrifice, alignment without alliance. Iran thought it had a bloc behind it. What the war has revealed is something looser, colder, and perhaps more realistic. A marketplace of strategic interests in which everyone may matter, but no one is owed rescue.